Good evening. I'm Allison Schilling, Senior Program Officer at the museum. It's my pleasure to welcome you all to this evening's forum on the Grimke sisters with historian Kerri Greenidge. And in the second half of the program, we'll be joined by historian Jacqueline Jones. Dr. Greenidge has close ties to us here in Concord as an advisor to the Robbins House, the historic site dedicated to raising awareness of Concord's African, African-American, and anti-slavery history, and as an advisor to the Concord Museum during the redesign process of our new permanent galleries. Dr. Greenidge received her doctorate in American Studies at Tufts University and is currently the Director of American Studies at Tufts University and co-director of the African American Trail Project, a website that maps out more than 200 historic sites across our Commonwealth to help trace the history of Massachusetts African American residents from slavery to Black Lives Matter. And there are a few stops here in Concord. Dr. Greenidge's first book, Black Radical: The Life and Times of William Monroe Trotter, was published in 2019, and we were delighted to host a forum on the book soon after its publication. I do encourage you all to watch the recording if you didn't get to see it live. It's on YouTube and our website. This evening, Dr. Greenidge is joining us to discuss her most recent book, released just yesterday, The Grimkes: The Legacy of Slavery in an American Family. The cover story of the New York Times Book Review last week, Michael P. Jeffries described the Grimkes as an ambitious book, not only because of its large cast of characters, but because it offers so many insights about racial strife in the United States. An intimate and provocative account of a family's intergenerational struggle to remake itself. Greenidge takes the Grimke sisters off their pedestal so that we understand them as pieces of tapestry that could only be sewn in America. We are all grateful to have Dr. Greenidge with us this evening to offer a new and significant examination of this famous American family. And we are equally privileged that in the second half of this evening's program, Dr. Greenidge will be joined in conversation with Jacqueline Jones, Professor Emerita from the University of Texas. Professor Jones is the author of several books, including Labor of Love, Label of Sorrow, Black Women, Work, and the Family, From Slavery to the Present, which was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize and won the Bancroft Prize the year it was published. She has won numerous grants and awards, including a MacArthur Fellowship. She served as vice president for the professional division of the American Historical Association and is a past president of the American Historical Association. Her current project, Dr. Greenidge will be signing copies of the Grimkes, which are for sale, thanks to our partnership with the Concord Bookshop. I hope you all enjoy the program, and please join me in welcoming Dr. Greenidge.
Thank you so much, Concord Museum, and thank you so much to everyone in Concord. I've had the delightful journey of working with the Concord Museum and Maria Madison in the Robbins House for many years, and you're doing wonderful work here. And I came in and I was like, a tear came to my eye to see the actual exhibits inside. It's wonderful, wonderful. My mother will be very upset that I left my own copy in my car because I was so enthralled with all of your exhibits in here. So I promise I will give it back. I have more. I can give you stuff to purchase them. But I thought how I would begin is doing just a brief reading from the beginning of the book, because I think it sets the stage for what the project is trying to do. And I think it also sets the stage for the types of questions that I believe the Grimke sisters, Angelina and Sarah Grimke, but also their African-American nephews, Archibald Henry Grimke, Francis James Grimke, and John Grimke, how all of that coalesces around one another. And so I'll read just a little bit. And then I will open it up to have a wonderful conversation. I'm kind of geeking out a little bit. One of my very big idols in grad school is Jacqueline Jones. So I love a Federal Express train snaked its way up the Atlantic coast on the New York, New Haven, and Hartford line. It left Union Station in Washington, D.C., bound for Boston, where the heat was so oppressive that wilted citizens slept in the city's commons between Tremont and Beacon Streets, and anxious mothers stayed up all night walking their infants up and down tenement sidewalks strewn with mattresses and pillows. They were afraid that their babies would fall asleep, overheat, and not wake up with the sunrise. Temperatures in Hartford, Connecticut were so high that one man, driven mad by the sweat and unrelenting mugginess, scaled a utility pole until authorities prodded him down with brooms and sticks. With the train bustling toward Connecticut over 1 hour behind schedule, Angelina Weld Grimke tried anything she could to keep cool in the Pullman car. She wore only a light kimono and slept bare on her mattress, arms dangling through the window, so that the breeze from the passing countryside could counteract the sweat pouring from every surface, as she said, of her body. She had taken this trip from the District of Columbia to Boston countless times. Although she lived and taught in the district, she spent summers and most holidays gallivanting around the New England countryside, where she had spent most of her adolescence and later childhood. She usually read or wrote letters to friends on the train, but the heat was so suffocating that she found herself unable to do anything more than look languidly out the window. As the train approached Bridgeport, Connecticut, a loud crash and the sound of screeching brakes jolted her awake. People screamed and glass shattered while her Pullman car jumped the track and lurched down a 20-foot embankment. 12 people died and 44 were wounded. Angelina Weld Grimke was one of the luckier ones, even though her back was broken and her luggage lost. All of her clothes, money, and personal papers muddled with the rest of the debris at the bottom of the Bridgeport embankment. Her long recovery would begin at the local hospital. Some of the dead had been so badly mutilated that it took weeks for family members to identify their remains. News of the train crash and Angelina's near death spread like wildfire through the so-called colored elite, a small yet influential class of Black people whose educations, family history, and relative economic stability tasked them with, quote, developing the best of this race that they may guide the mass away from the contamination and death of the worse, end quote. Angelina, called Nana by everyone who knew her, was a favorite daughter of this elite. Despite rumors of her madness and despite whispers of her, quote, inappropriate relationships, end quote, with women. Her father, Archibald Henry Grimke, was a co-founder of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, a graduate of Harvard Law School, an author and sometime newspaper editor, and a former American consul to Santo Domingo, the Dominican Republic. In this position, he had earned respect from his fellow, quote, colored elite at the expense of African-descended subjects living under American empire. But what he lacked in transnational Black solidarity, he made up for in wealth and education. With his nearly white skin, his Washington, D.C. real estate investments, and his familiarity with some of New England's most renowned scholar reformers, Archibald, called Archie, had been a fixture in the colored elite for some time. He and his brother, the Washington Presbyterian minister Francis James Grimke, called Frank, first arrived at the Boston offices of the New England Freedmen's Aid Society in 1866. In the 45 years between their appearance in Boston and Nana's near-fatal train crash in Bridgeport, the Grimke brothers earned the praise of social reformers, Black and white, who chronicled their various accomplishments in the press in order to counter popular assumptions about Black intellectual and moral inferiority. The multiple successes of Archie and Frank, both born enslaved in Charleston, offered evidence, as one Black newspaper put it, quote, of the colored man's worth, end quote. Those successes included Frank's pastorship at 15th Street Presbyterian, Archie's Boston law firm, and both brothers shared residence in the respectable Strivers Row neighborhood of Washington, D.C. Yet as Nana spent nearly 2 months at the Bridgeport Hospital before moving to a friend's house in Boston, where Archie dressed her wounds and reset her cast, the same talented tenth, as Du Bois called them, that celebrated the Grimkes and Nana's survival, and who praised the Grimke brothers, privately gossiped about Angelina Grimke and her family. She faced accusations of her inappropriate relationship with women. She faced accusations that she herself had had a scandalous relationship with the public school system segregated in Washington, D.C. Archie, however, scoffed at all of these speeches by his friends and cohorts. He reminded Nana, quote, that the colored people of high position, as we are often wont to eat their own. Nearly 1,000 miles to the west, on the plains of southern Illinois, the Grimke name did not place a similar burden on Dr. Angelina Grimke Hamilton, the only surviving granddaughter of 19th century abolitionist and women's rights orator Angelina Grimke. 8 years older than her black third cousin, with whom she never associated, Angelina Hamilton was also known by her childhood nickname, Nana, hence the name The Two Nanas. Unlike the black Nana, however, Nana Hamilton was brought up to exalt her Grimke family history as proof of her ancestors', quote, unimpeachable service to the oppressed, while ignoring their slaveholding legacy. For instance, she was never told that her family had actually owned slaves until she herself was about 17 years old. Sarah Weld Hamilton, called Sissy by her family, the daughter of Angelina Grimke and her husband Theodore Weld, and the white Nana's mother, was raised and raised her daughter Nana in the sleepy, mostly white towns of Michigan, Kansas, and wherever else in the Midwestern countryside that her husband, named Reverend Hamilton, was called to serve. Sissy was proud of her family history, so proud that she spent much of her adult life trying to chronicle her mother and her father's biographies, although she was told time and again that this history was not for her thinking, that she should, quote, cast a bright light upon the history of the Grimkes, quote, and stop proselytizing about the care of the Negro, end quote. Because Nana Hamilton believed the story of her Grimke ancestors, she was neither forced to confront the legacies of her relatives' slaveholding past, nor called to reckon with how this past reverberated throughout the racial system in which she thrived. She never had to face the fact that she made a home and career for herself in one of the most notorious sundown towns in the country, hundreds of miles from the East Coast reform circles that had launched her grandparents' and great-aunts' activist careers. The town was Anna, Illinois, a sleepy and deeply set farming community located just north of the Kentucky border. In 1909, as Nana Hamilton began her medical career in state hospitals across the region, white townspeople there waged a bloody war against their black neighbors. While Anna's white residents had long bristled at the presence of black migrants in their town, that November their rage reached a boiling point as they attempted to lynch a black man named William Froggy James, who was accused of murdering a white woman. James had fled by train from the nearby town of Cairo, Illinois, where the alleged murder took place, and although the crowd in Anna didn't succeed at first in forcing James off the train car and hanging him from a tree, they eventually helped white citizens from Cairo recapture the black man as he hid in the woods near Dongola, Illinois. White residents of Anna were also there as the crowd in Cairo hung James from a tree, riddled his body with hundreds of bullets, then tore off his limbs, ears, and head in an orgy of unrestrained racial violence for which no one in the thousands-deep crowd was ever punished. Nana Hamilton, the white Nana, Angelina Grimke's second cousin, she had not yet arrived as a doctor at Anna State Hospital when James was lynched. Yet there is no doubt that she read about it in the local newspaper as she traveled from her post at the state hospital branch at Lincoln in various schools for the insane across central and southern Illinois. Mob lynched two at Cairo, shouted a newspaper headline that she kept wrapped up in her own records that are still at the University of Michigan. Lynched two at Cairo, boasted the Daily Bloomington Pantagraph. Even with these ubiquitous headlines and the notoriety that James's murder brought to the region, Nana Hamilton, granddaughter of two of the previous century's most famous white abolitionists and second cousin to leading members of the country's black elite, neither signed her name to the anti-lynching petition that blanketed Illinois in the aftermath of the lynching, nor did she publicly condemn the violence when she settled in Anna nearly 3 years later. In fact, when she was asked about her decision to settle in the town, she merely stated, quote, "Here is a good place for enjoying the twilight of life. I could imagine having her father, who was then suffering of dementia, in a peaceful hospital here. Indeed," she said, "it is a nice American town." So the legacies of slavery, the legacies of who deals with enslavement, who deals with the consequences of slaveholding, is the subject of this book. The legacy of American slavery and racial violence within families is also the subject of this book. The Grimkes is the first collective biography ever written about the Grimke family that includes the famous white Grimke sisters, Sarah Grimke and Angelina Grimke Weld, with whom most of us are probably familiar. Their black nephews, Archibald, Francis, and John Grimke, Frank's wife, Charlotte Fortin Grimke, and Archie's daughter, the Harlem Renaissance poet and playwright, and the victim of that train crash, Angelina Weld Grimke. The white Grimke sisters were famous in their own time, and they remain so to this day, because they are viewed most, just as Nana Hamilton, their most famous white descendant, saw them, as anti-slavery and feminist heroes who left behind the comforts of plantation life in South Carolina for a harder but moral life of writing and activism in the North, right? This is the story we get about the Grimkes. This was talked about in Gator Lerner's most famous book, one of my favorites when I was in elementary school, The Grimkes from South Carolina, which effectively absolved white Southern women of racial guilt because of their supposed economic and social subordination to slaveholding white men. But as scholars, including Thavolia Glimp and Stephanie Jones Rogers, have recently shown, white women benefited from slaveholding as white people, even as they struggled against patriarchal systems as women. The Grimke sisters' anti-slavery activism was financed and supported by the labor and exploitation of black women, some of whom were related to them, many of whom were sexually exploited by their brothers, their father, and their male family members. This book builds on the latest scholarship to show how this gendered form of white privilege shaped both the Grimke sisters' relationship with black people and, perhaps most significantly, white women reformers' relationship to the black women who seeded the fertile ground out of which their activism grew. This book, I will also say, is relevant to our own time. In our own era, 2022, during the first decades of the 21st century, America's black elite exists in a world remarkably like the early 20th century progressive era in which the black Grimkes lived. Like the revolutionary promise of civil war and Reconstruction, the potential for racial and economic justice wrought by the recent civil rights movement of the 1960s and 1970s has been overtaken in our own time by continued anti-black racial violence, political disenfranchisement, and socioeconomic inequality that undergirds so much of late-stage American capitalism. The Grimkes is thus a family biography that resonates in the lives of those who struggle with the personal and political consequences of raising children and families in the aftermath of 21st century betrayal of the radical human rights promises of the 1960s. Much like Archibald Grimke, Francis J. Grimke, and Charlotte Fortin Grimke, a famous abolitionist and women's rights activist in her own right, all of whom lived through and helped shape radical politics, slavery's violent collapse, and the egalitarian promises of radical Reconstruction. Americans who have lived recently through the racial and social upheavals of the modern civil rights, women's rights, and anti-war movements of the 1960s have raised children like myself and grandchildren like my nieces in a world that forgets the lessons of the recent past in favor of neoliberalism, neo-fascism, and the growth of racial inequality. For 21st century African Americans like the Grimkes in the early 20th century, in particular, who live at a time when middle-class incomes, educational attainment, and material acquisitions are no guarantee of future economic and personal stability, the Grimke family story offers and dissects the historical roots and systemic and traumatic effects of a talented 10th anxious about its future sustainability. It is my hope that this book will challenge the way that we look at white reformers, the way that we look at the legacy of white women's culpability in slavery, and the legacies of racial violence within families and outside of families, and how that legacy impacts every members of families and members of society. Thank you. Yes? Sit down?
Yeah. Well, Kerri, first of all, congratulations on the book. I must say, it reads like a novel. You know, the character development is just amazing. The way you interweave these stories and tell us about intergenerational conflicts and loves. It's just such a compelling story. So first of all, I wanted to say that. And I thought we would begin by talking about Angelina and Sarah's relationships to Archie and Frank, their nephews in particular, because that's such a complex relationship. And, you know, for a long time, they didn't even know of the existence of these nephews, right, until 1868. And by that time, both were teenagers. And they were unaware that their brother had these 3 young men with Nancy Weston. They were unaware of the torment these young men had endured. And you say at one point that they were very loving, but also very critical of their nephew. So why don't you talk a little bit about this very complicated relationship they had?
Yeah, well, I will first off start by saying is that I was always told the story of the Grimke sisters in one compartment and the stories of the Grimke brothers in another department. So the stories were usually told separately. And if they met in the popular conversation amongst historians or scholars, they met in this idea of that moment in 1868 when the Grimke sisters pick up the National Anti-Slavery Standard and they see the name Grimke in an article about Lincoln University, which had existed in Pennsylvania, which was where the Grimke brothers went to school. And that's kind of where the story begins. Gary Lerner's book, that's where the story kind of ends. Mark Perry's book comes out, and that's a turning point in that narrative as well. But I really wanted to delve in, what do we know about the Grimke sisters and their relationship to this horrendously violent Southern slaveholding culture in which they were raised? And how does that inform the way that they relate to African American people who are not subjects, right? So who are not people who they're tasked with freeing from slavery. And how do they relate when they grow up in, which by all accounts, all the records I read, was a sadistically violent slaveholding culture in Charleston in particular. So stories casually told of, you know, black enslaved people being forced to stand up all night because white people wanted fans put on them. Black people drowning in the water and the white people, you know, pushing their bodies out of onto the side of the city streets and leaving them there so that black people could then move them out of the way. The torturous sort of notion of Charleston slavery, which was notorious at the time, but also not notorious in terms of what we know about slaveholding cultures in the 19th century. And so my question was, what did it mean if you grew up in that environment where the Grimke sisters themselves talk about the cruelty that they saw around them all the time. One of their sisters starving a black woman to death in the house because she could, right? And sort of this was one of the things they talk about in their treatise, American Slavery as It Is, which was, you know, one of the seminal works of the abolitionist movement. What does that mean then when they meet black people who are not in the position of victim and are not, but are also in the position of being victimized by a system in which the Grimke sisters' wealth comes? And so the relationship, to answer your question, that develops between the Grimke sisters developed at a point, I argue in the book, when really Sarah and Angelina Grimke were considered at the twilight, quote unquote, of their careers. They were still involved in anti-slavery activism and women's rights activism, of course. But Angelina Grimke Weld got married. She had 3 children, her own children, and had very difficult parenting relationships with her own biological children. So there's lots of evidence that she suffered from severe, what we would now call postpartum depression, and postpartum issues with her body, being bedridden for 2 years after her second son was born. And one of my arguments is that that then pushed the Grimke sisters out of the limelight in terms of the anti-slavery movement. They were from about 1838 to roughly 1840, sort of the pinnacles and the face of women's involvement in the abolitionist movement. And then they retreat so that Angelina can raise her family. Not entirely, I would say, by choice. I think it sort of had more to do with the fact that she had 3 children and struggled with raising her children. And so she raises her children, and the children are raised amongst the Welds and the Grimkes in this, I kind of was joking with the historian the other day, kind of this hippie household where they run this school in Raritan Bay, New Jersey, that's an interracial school. It's invites children of both sexes to attend, and it's this like progressive education, and William Lloyd Garrison's children go there, and a couple of the children from Concord go down there as well. I mean, it's considered like, if you're a progressive person in the 1840s, this is the school you go to. This is what the Grimke Welds turn their focus to. But as they're doing that and they're raising their own children, they struggle a lot, and the record shows this, with their relationship to Black actual people. And the fact that when they arrived, the Grimke sisters arrived in Philadelphia, there was already this long infrastructure of Black people, radical abolition, establishing their own schools, fighting against slavery in the city, raising their own money. And the Grimke sisters are not used to that. They're used to a situation in which white people are at the top. And the relationship they have with Blackness is that Black people are either victims that they're going to give themselves up to save, or B, that they're kind of, they're not really in the scene that they're setting in terms of activism, right? And so my question then was, what happens when they then discover not only that they're all of this violence that they've grown up with, that they allude to, that they talk about pretty freely and all in their casually both and then personally in their own accounts. What happens when they reach the stage of their life, their own children are grown, their own children by all accounts were not as successful as the Grimke Weld family wanted them to be. They're in a stage of their life where they're both lamenting the fact that they had this once great family name, as Angelina Grimke says, that is now ruined by slavery and the demise of slavery, and the fact that her family were staunch Confederates up until the very end. She enters a stage where suddenly she discovers Grimkes, and the Grimke name now is these 2 young African-American boys who have made their way from Charleston enslavement, where they were horribly brutalized by their half-brother, which I'll get into in a minute, and yet they're going to Lincoln University. By all intents, they're brilliant on their own, right? With the help of their mother, who was enslaved, who, amazingly, none of the white women in the Grimke family talk about, although they allude to her in letters, right? And so what does that mean? What kind of mental space does that take to have a relationship with those boys and those young men at a point where the Grimke sisters' own activism was still in 1838, 1840, and their own approach to younger people was caught up in their own relationship with their own children, and what it meant that they were these brilliant anti-slavery activists and none of their children became activists, right? Their oldest son became an objector to the Civil War, and basically said he didn't think that there were 2 sides to the Civil War, and that he wasn't going to participate. They had another son who suffered from mental illness, and then their daughter who was sort of given the task of raising and taking care of her brother. So a very long, convoluted way of saying that I really wanted to concentrate on and give a theme to what happens when all of that, you're required, the Grimke sisters were required to react to their Black nephews, not as they had been ever trained to react to Black people before. And these are young people who are their brother's children by an enslaved woman. And you can no longer deny the violence that occurred in your household that you've been alluding to for the past 40 or 50 years. And so that's really how I entered the project. That's really the relationship that I wanted to look into. For all intents and purposes, the Grimke sisters supported the 2 older Grimke brothers, but in a way that both of the Grimke brothers found in their own way problematic. And they did not support the younger Grimke brother, John. because in the white Grimke's estimation, John was slow. Now, there's no estimation that is actually true. What is more of evidence is that the Grimke sisters became very overwhelmed by the emotional toll of interacting with the Grimke brothers, who showed up at their house and could read and write and were, set on, I want to go to Harvard, when one of them saying, I want to become a minister, and they're not the type of black sort of subservient image that these women are used to handling.
And I think you're right that maybe the sisters projected onto their nephews that drive, that ambition that their own children were lacking in.
Yes.
Because they seemed so harsh. They were very critical
Yes.
of these nephews, and how they were doing in school and so forth. And meanwhile, their own children showed no real
Yes.
drive and no real interest in anything. So it seemed like kind of a complicated relationship.
Complicated, and I think also that political idea that that many white abolitionists, particularly in New England, had at the end of the Civil War, which is that all the country needs is just pick yourself up by your bootstraps, enslave people, slavery's over. What black people need is that they need to work, right? And again, not paying attention to the fact that the economy was based on slavery, so black people were working. But that was the idea. And so the Grimke sisters became very fixated on that for their nephews in a way that basically completely discount the reality of their situation. The Grimke brothers make their way up to Lincoln University. They have absolutely no money. They made their way up there because their mother, who was still enslaved and who, by the way, could not read because the Grimke family refused to teach her, but taught her sons by saving what money she could to send them to a school that was run by a notorious slaveholding preacher in Charleston, but got them educated, made sure that they then were able to leave Charleston. So this is all Nancy, their black mother's doing, right? So that by the time the white Grimkes come in, this is what Nancy has done for her sons, right? And Nancy is still in Charleston, working, unable to read, facing horrible violence that's occurring during Reconstruction in Charleston. And the Grimke sisters, there's like a disconnect, right? When the boys ask, we haven't seen our mother since we left. And we want to see her because we hear reports that Charleston is being marauded by white supremacists. Can we save money, or can there be a way to bring her here? And they say, oh, no, don't spend your money on that. You need to save. You're selfish, right? Save, right? Yeah. And there's little bits of that in the relationship that I think is very telling. And then what it's telling to me is how then the Grimke brothers enact that experience in their own relationships to blackness and to politics and to how they see themselves and their family.
And on that note, I just wanted to bring up, and this is a story, I think it's the very end of the book, and Archie is, I don't know whether he's on his deathbed, but he's very old. This is in 1928, and his daughter, who is just so beautifully drawn by you, Nana, she's a poet, she's a playwright, she's rebellious, she's a lesbian, she's just so, such an interesting person, and she wants to know, she really does yearn to know more about the family. And she says, to Archie at one point, is there anything you want to share with me?
Yes.
And he says, the past is past. Haven't I given you a life of perfect harmony for which the past is no longer relevant?
Yes.
And that he just wants to shut down her interest in her own history and the history of her family. And talk a little bit about this theme of respectability, because the Nancy Westons and their Charlotte Fortons, this, and Archie, of course, with the 15th Street Presbyterian Church, respectability was really the core of their being in certain ways, and it really shaped their relationships, and even Archie's relationship with his daughter. So
yeah, I mean, there's been a lot of work done recently by historians on this idea of respectability politics within the African American elite in particular, but and so I really wanted to explore what that looks like, and that basically means that respectability discourse in terms of when the rest of the country and the world is looking down on blackness, black people are going to lift up that blackness and you're going to achieve. And it's very relevant for today when we think of, all that needs to happen is like go to school, get a job, do really well, and isn't that great, right? Racism will disappear. And we're kind of living in the aftermath of that, and in a very big way. And the Grimke brothers were raised in that atmosphere in a different era, but one that's unfortunately is very similar to our own, which is that, they're born enslaved. Their mother, Nancy Weston, as I go through in the book, and it was very complicated going through her family history because most historians had said, well, there's no way you can uncover anything about her. There's no way you can find anything. She didn't write anything. She couldn't read or write. Everything is conjecture. And yet, we know from what she told her sons, some of it being true, some of it being stories that parents tell their children when they want their children to succeed more than their family thinks that maybe they themselves have succeeded. That she was very connected to a free black family called the Weston family that was very famous in Charleston then and still to this day has descendants that still live there. And she was enslaved. And so what that did in my portrait of the book and interpretation is that what that did to somebody who was very, very proud, who came from a family of free black people, who had been told that their freedom in this very violent slaveholding society was something, right? So free black people in the city of Charleston had their own clubs and their own school and their own societies, and most of them had, many of them, the black women who were free black women, had relationships with white men, and those white men cared for in some way their black children. The Grimkes did not, which was considered sort of different than many of the other white slaveholding men in the city. And so what did it mean for Nancy Weston to be enslaved? All of her siblings are free, and many of her siblings who are women have managed to have relationships with white men that they've managed to create some semblance of negotiation within the slave society. And Nancy Weston couldn't because she's enslaved to the Grimkes, right? The way that she combated that was to use respectability to tell her sons, as from the time they were very little, and they're enslaved. Picture this: they're enslaved. They know that they're enslaved. So there's been a lot of talk. They somehow didn't know they were enslaved. Not true, right? The Grimke said they always knew they were enslaved, but their mother told them they come from this group called the Colored Westons, and the Westons are the people who run the hotels. Charleston then is a majority black city. Black people ran the hotels. They ran the restaurants. They ran the when people came to visit. They're the ones who are running everything in the town. And so Nancy Weston says to her sons, those are who you come from, right? A very powerful thing to say when you're raising your children in poverty and in violence. What happens, though, once the Civil War ends, and those distinctions between black people that were drawn in Charleston, say, are not the same, right? And not only that, what happens when your relationship to the white people who created that system is that that's your family, right? And so I'm very interested in the ways in which that develops into this respectability politics that, on one hand, created achievement in the two older Grimke brothers' lives. Archie graduates from Harvard Law School, ends up creating a law firm, a black-owned law firm, one of two in Boston, very successful. Ended up becoming the head of the Westboro State Hospital for the Insane, one of the first black men to become that for roughly 10 years. So Westboro, I live out in Westboro, so Westboro State Hospital, that whole complex, that was his design. We need a bigger, more extensive way of treating people who are mentally ill. All of these achievements, right? His brother, Frank Grimke, becomes a graduate of Princeton Theological Seminary, becomes minister and pastor of the most exclusive black church, if not in the country, at least on the East Coast. Ends up becoming president of the NAACP. So these are people, this is like the breakthrough story that we tell ourselves. And yet there's a lot of conflict amongst them and sadness amongst them to create and maintain that respectability. Mm-hmm. And then he has a daughter. Archibald Grimke has his daughter, Angelina, Weld Grimke, who becomes the playwright and poet and is evidence she's lesbian, bisexual, she's, sexually fluid, I guess we would say nowadays. And her mother is a white woman. And so Archibald Grimke ends up having a relationship with a white woman. And when his daughter is a little girl, she's raised for her first 7 years in Michigan and was not told she was black, right? At least that's kind of what the letters happen, right? She's kind of told, all you have to do is, like, pick yourself up by your bootstraps, you're loved, you're smart, right? Her mother was, there's evidence her white mother was a Christian Scientist. The Christian scientists don't believe in race. And then finally, her white mother, around 1887, something happens. It's really unclear in the records what happens, but she suddenly says, I can't take care of this black child in rural Michigan, puts her on a train, sends her to Boston, and drops her off with Archie. And so if you're skilled with the gift of respectability, your response to that might be, oh, just pick yourself up, 7-year-old, right? You're living in Hyde Park, you're still around your uncle Theodore Weld, who was still around, adored his African-American nephews and his little grandniece. Presence in her life, she's going to the best schools in New England, attends Carleton College in Minnesota, eventually goes to what becomes Wellesley College, very well educated, and yet they can't control her as a person. And she was never interested in being like a society woman. She was interested and was phenomenally good at writing poetry from the time she's like 7. So the archive is amazing. You can see the poems she's writing when she's 6 years old, and she's about to get on the train to her mother. So her mother's she doesn't know she's about to be put on the train, but she like writes this little poem, it's all about the train. And then she's put on the train and she writes these letters to her mother, when am I coming back? And her mother, I'll be there in like a few months, right? And never comes back. And so what does that mean when you have to deal with respectability, number one? You have to deal with like dynamics of race, you have to deal with the traumas of slavery and slaveholding, you have to deal with the fact you're in a political time of violent Reconstruction and its aftermath. And yet you're just trying to raise a child in any circumstances. What does it mean that you don't have the language to talk with that child about what actually is happening, right? They didn't talk about the fact that Nancy was enslaved, although Angelina asks questions when she's a little kid, and they're just like, you asked too many questions, right? Well, if the Grimke sisters were so nice, she asked at one point, why can't Grandma read, right? No answer, right? So it's very, and it's the beauty of archives, it's the beauty of being able to look at records to try to understand what's beneath what people are saying is happening and what's beneath what they're actually saying. And I think this is, we all have families, we all know this happens all the time, right? Particularly as we get to the holidays, what are people actually saying? And what is actually happening, right? And then couple with that, this idea that you're from a notorious slaveholding family that has this very notorious, well-documented record of extreme violence. And none of the men in that family, from what I could find, could be described as a quote-unquote kind master. That's not the Grimkes, right? As much as the Grimke sisters, that's their story that they say, right?
There's so many topics, and I did want to, and I'll just mention this because I don't know whether we have time to go over it, the cruelty of the white Grimkes. I think it's, is it Henry who, for sport, beats Stephen?
Yes.
Bangs his head. This is a young enslaved man, bangs his head on tables, pushes him against the wall so that it seems he got brain damage from this constant trauma. Montague going after one of his half-brothers. And the mother is a monster. I mean, the way she treats enslaved people. So that's one issue that comes out so vividly in the book, and might relate to why the sisters Angelina and Sarah left and went north. I mean, this was a lot for anybody to take in, to see that kind of abuse, constantly bloodshed. I mean, awful. But so But I did want to end on this because I think there are probably questions from the audience too. And that is about the experience of doing the research and during the COVID and what it was like to plow through. I mean, there must have been hundreds of letters. What kind
hundreds.
of, yeah.
Oh yeah, I mean, so for my first book, I ended up doing a lot of research on the Grimkes because Archibald Grimke was in conflict with Trotter. And so I did a lot of that research. And I put a lot of that to the side because I was noticing in that research Archibald's references to his family. So he would go through these wonderful stories on how great his aunts were. And then there'd be a sentence where he'd say, but you know so-and-so was a brute. Okay, Trotter, and then Trotter being Trotter would get mad and they'd have a riff and, all this. But it was amazing to me that so much of the violence within the household was recorded and that the Grimke sisters themselves, I would say, was one of the reasons that they wrote their, treatise, American Slavery as It Is. A lot of that is stories from their house. Right, so their famous book that's talking about the horrors of slavery. They say, "Oh, I once knew this woman." It's actually their mother they're talking about. And so, for me, it was really important that I get access to as many of the personal letters and diaries as I could that hadn't been really covered by a lot of people who have covered the Grimkes ad nauseum. I really wanted to look at the letters that were covered, what couldn't fit in other volumes that have been published on them and what could. And then looking at the records of the members of their family who talked a lot about what their household was and the casualty with which they talked about the violence. So what you're referring to is that an enslaved man named Stephen, who was trained to be a butler in the Grimke household, he's the same age as Henry, who's the white man, who's the father of the Grimke brothers. What we know about him is that by the time Stephen's an adult, he's suffering from fits, and the Grimke sisters' mother wants to get rid of him, but doesn't want to lose the money, right? And doesn't know what to do. She writes to her daughters who are living anti-slavery lives in Philadelphia and says, what should I do? And it comes out in those letters the way that young man was treated from the time he was 5 years old, and that Henry and his brothers were basically allowed to horribly abuse this young man, bang his heads into walls, beat him up until he passed out, take his horrible and very graphic descriptions. And the mother talking about this as she's deciding what to do with this young boy who's now a man who suffers from seizures and probably some type of brain injury. And previous historians had said, isn't it nice that the Grimke sisters invited Stephen to live with them in New Jersey and gave him his freedom. And yes, that might be, in this grand scheme of things, I suppose, okay. But what does it mean that you grew up watching this person be that severely abused? And that's just kind of part of the household, right? And then the comment on Stephen going forward is, we don't understand why he can't work, right, in New Jersey, right? Why can't, this is horrible, this isn't a good example of the anti-slavery creed, he's not getting out and paying his way. And so that to me is kind of the crux of the relationship in this family. And I think in the crux of a relationship between slaveholder and enslaved and the communities that they inhabit and how complex that can be. And to answer your question in terms of access, I was very, very lucky that at the beginning of the pandemic, I was due to go on a research trip. COVID hit and that was canceled, everything shut down. And I was lucky enough that I contacted the archives at the Clement Library at University of Michigan and basically said, I'm doing this book. I don't even know if I can do it now, but I just need access to even stuff you don't think is relevant. Just send it. If anything that in the Grimke file and all of their papers are there, just send it to me. So even if it's a relative who's not a Grimke sister, right, send that because I just want to read what they're saying. And so that's how I kind of began. It was COVID, so I literally would wake up and, read this stuff from 8 in the morning, go on my walk, and then sort of catalog it and have it in there.
The book tells us so much about the Black elite, slaveholding Southern women, the institution of bondage. It's just terrific. And I do want to leave. Alison, is there time for some questions from?
We have some time for questions.
if anyone else, I don't want to monopolize the conversation here to the questions. Yes?
Hi, thank you so much for doing this. I'm so excited to read your book. If you could talk about maybe like either one person that you would have loved to meet or like one event that you would have loved to be present for.
I think I would have loved to meet Angelina Grimke, the playwright. She was very spoiled, but then when you kind of read how her family treated her, I think it would have been fascinating to see how it is that she's creating so much art. So she's very, very prolific. There's a volume that was edited by a wonderful scholar named Kerri that's all of her writings, and even that is only probably about 40% of everything that she ever wrote. She was constantly writing poetry, plays, short stories. She revised her most famous play, Rachel, which is what she's famous for, multiple times. She was a mentor to younger artists during the Harlem Renaissance. And so I probably would have been, most have liked to talk to her, although I think it might have been difficult because she reached a point in her life where I think she learned to kind of mask a lot of herself because her family didn't allow her to express herself in a lot of ways. And so what would have been like to talk to somebody who reached a point in their life where that was kind of where they were. They expressed all themselves through their art, and yet when you met them in person was sort of seen by the middle of her life kind of as being very staid and not the woman who like was lying naked in the train on her way through up the East Coast.
Other questions? Yes.
Hi. First of all, I didn't know I was seated next to the woman of honor tonight.
Oh, thank you.
But I'm intrigued that you sunk yourself into this society with all its conflicts and violence, and yet you sit here smiling. And we see it today in today's society, the violence that can come from hatred from whatever direction it's coming. How has it hit your heart to live with them, the Grimkes?
Oh, that's actually a very good question. I think I found Angelina Grimke, the playwright, amazingly funny in her private letters to her friends. So she was an only child, but she had all of these friends amongst the black elite, and she has sent everybody letters all the time, and she was getting letters from them, and many of them went on to have careers in their own right in the Harlem Renaissance. And so she was amazingly witty and funny with them, kind of talking and gossiping about this black elite of which she was a part and of which she kind of had this very complicated relationship with, and that she knew very, very well. And that she wasn't shy about criticizing kind of privately. So I think that was one of the things. I love her literature, so getting able to read all of her poetry and her short stories, and even the stuff that isn't published or canonized, was fabulous. She definitely was like an avant-garde writer in the manner of like an E. Cummings. She did all this verse that was like lowercase, before that was like the thing to do in the 20s. She, came out with these very complex psychological portraits of people in dreams. I mean, she's like this amazingly prolific and talented writer. And so I think that's what really drew me. I also was very drawn in by the connections that all of these families had to one another, and what it might have meant to live, say, in Boston or in Philadelphia and be in a black community and have all of these very personal relationships with black people, say, in DC or in Delaware, right? That were very, very deep, and you spent summers with people, and you had this closeness with people. And so if you were, Archibald Grimke would say, if you were a black elite in Boston, you knew the black elite in Detroit. And so that then began to be, I wanted to explore that a little bit, and that was actually very comforting, because of course COVID, everyone's alone, and I was lucky enough to be with my family. I live in a big house, so I was perfectly fine, but I was like, oh, it's kind of interesting to see these bonds of community as fragmented and as problematic as they can be. that you have these communities that are very closely knit, even as they're being wrenched apart by this violence and these legacies of that violence.
Time for one more.
Another question? While we're waiting, I just want to say, that Angelina and Sarah remind me of these other white abolitionists. I mean, William Lloyd Garrison had a very difficult time dealing with Black men and women who were not enslaved.
Yes.
He was very, obviously eloquent and influential in the abolitionist movement, very courageous. And yet when it came to dealing with Frederick Douglass or Eleanor Eldridge,
Yes.
he really couldn't wrap his head around, Black men and women of distinction. So,
Yes.
and it's sort of like the Grimke sisters, I think.
Yeah, and I really wanted to look at that, just that relationship, which many Black abolitionists spoke about all the time, right? Why is it that we can go to these meetings and hear, eloquent speakers like the Grimke sisters, and then when we go to Friends meeting, they tolerate the segregation and they get a don't bat an eye, even though they just gave a speech that says segregation is wrong, right? How is it that we can exist in this the Grimke Wells run that hippie school in New Jersey, and they have it's integrated, and yet there's different ways that Black students were treated if they were children of people who the Grimkes knew, versus if you didn't know the Grimkes and you had money and you sent your Black child there, right? In terms of what kind of environment did you have there, and then what does that mean when then you're asked to relate to your nephews who are actual people of their own, right? And are actually, they have their own needs, their desires, they're doing pretty well, and what does it mean that you can't have that type of relationship with Black people except for if they're victimized in some way.
Well, I wanted to say thank you for the conversation, but thank you especially for the book. It's great.
Thank you so
It's
much.
great.
And again, thank you so much for coming.